Okay, I want to preface the preface by saying that I'm doing this over a drawing because I thought it was kind of a cool idea and can avoid me being on camera, and because I just got an Apple Pencil, so this is the first drawing that I've ever done with it. And I've always been pretty good at copying references, but I am not creative with it because I'm terrified. So this is not a finished drawing, nor is it a finished conversation. So I want to preface this by saying that I really don't want it to sound like I'm telling people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and that's not what I mean by this at all. And I am just sharing my experience and what I believe to be in the zeitgeist right now, the spirit of the time. I think that there is a consciousness being raised around not only psychiatry as an industry, but obviously the systems we live under generally, and that the hyper individualistic capitalist society that we live under has actually created a lot of our suffering, and that the continual focus on self and this kind of atomistic understanding of what we're going through is not a comprehensive picture of the situation and not an accurate representation of our experiences to begin with. If, for instance, I knew what it was like to be autistic instead of the diagnostic criteria of restricted interests, for instance, and someone described what I experienced, which is that I can't do anything I haven't already done. I have to know the system of how absolutely everything works. From standing in line at a new restaurant, going to a new store, making new food, being in a new house, like when I was just staying house sitting at my mom's, that was extremely stressful. Anyways, basically just that, psychiatrists or these people that are supposed to understand our experiences, or at least used to attempt to understand our experiences in order to heal on a more holistic human level. And that, insurance companies and the pharmaceutical industry have basically shaped the way that this most intimate healing and understanding of human suffering takes place in. And most importantly, you need to thoroughly understand the way that you relate to your experience. And that for me, my experience doesn't even really necessarily have to change for my relation to it to change. And that there is a logic to what happens to me that can be parsed out. I have learned the patterns, can see the structure of what I'm experiencing. For me, that is where all of the magic has happened that medical treatment was never able to give me. And with that being said, there are 100% medical pharmaceutical treatments that have helped me as well. But I think that they would be nothing without this larger understanding. One of the most profound experiences I had on mushrooms was it made something click for me that you hear people say, but that I had never understood before, which is that I'm not my thoughts. I'm not even what I'm experiencing. And I think it was a 7 gram trip, and I could feel myself as the force behind all of my experiences, arranging them and trying to make sense of them. And that although my experience feels deeply fractured and disorganized because of the schizophrenia, I'm actually perfectly whole. And that, in my opinion and experience, this is where I am. This is what the self is. That is what I have to access in order to meta question what I'm experiencing and to flexibly shape those experiences, because I was extremely cognitively rigid. And I don't think it's a coincidence that all of these biohacking men, which I'm going to talk about, are kind of autistic coded. Okay, so I saw this post on Reddit because I feel like there is an awakening happening in the biohacking community right now. And I think I watched a YouTube video about this. So I think this is a general trend that people are noticing. The post was saying that the secret he found to alleviating his depression and anguish was basically changing the way he thinks. And that, it's not that complicated. There's not a magic pill. And all of these things that he tried before then to like chemically fix himself were ultimately in vain because the problem was his negative thinking patterns. This sounds really simple, but I don't think it's like, I don't know what I'm trying to say. But there was a comment on the post, is what I'm trying to say. There was a comment on the post that was taking issue with this and reacting very defensively, like the way that I would have reacted. Just, very recently saying, there's different kinds of depression. There's like viral induced depression, and I can't remember what he was talking about. Basically like the differentiating between this kind of psychological depression and a physiological issue causing like sickness behavior, basically, I guess. And I just don't think this distinction is real at all. Like, the brain rot induced by thinking that we can just take pills and have our problems be solved is irreparable. I literally handed my body over to doctors as a teenager because something was going wrong. And I trusted these Matrix people, putting on my tinfoil hat. I trusted these Matrix people to feed me pills and put me right again. And they could, but they were doing it like they did it so it just haphazardly. And it happened just like I think I probably would have come out of those. It was like the classic. Well, I just heard the term maniform as a term for describing the kind of prodromal symptoms of schizophrenic psychosis. Like it's like mania like, which I'd never heard before because I thought that's why schizoaffective exists, is to differentiate. But apparently that's when it does feel like they're completely inseparable. That these periods of excitement are like a fundamental part of the disease process, because it was like I was like a flame or whatever, and I would die. And we called it. I was diagnosed with depression. And they tried me on a bunch of different antidepressants. My point is also sort of that, is that like it wasn't just depression. It was like something quote unquote physiological or physical or whatever. But like everything is physiological and physical, and everything is psychological. I got really sick in fifth grade with multiple viruses, and then I developed chronic pain and arthritis. And the chronic pain was diagnosed as fibromyalgia, but I've only recently been diagnosed with non-radiographic spondyloarthritis, spinal arthritis that doesn't show up on an X-ray, which is huge because this has been going on since I was in fifth grade. And no one knew that the inflammation in my knee at that time was like an autoimmune disease. Seeing this physiological process happening that was also changing the way that I thought and warping reality along with it, and that this was a mutual process. It was a back and forth. It has happened both ways. I have had the whatever physiological instigator happen and then change my thoughts, and I've had my thoughts change my physiology and put me back into that place. And I'm not saying that you can like think yourself out of anything, or that like like what I'm talking about. I'm not saying like I still have like I can't make my chronic pain go away or whatever, and I still have schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and whatever that means. I don't know. Like, how many layers of self can there be? That's why I don't want to post anymore. Simulacra and simulation, you guys. It's true. Techno-capitalism gave me schizophrenia. The matrix of symbols overlaid on top of the matrix of symbols overlaid on top of this the see, why do I do that? With like I just try to keep it going. I don't know, I said I don't want to squander this platform, but maybe I do. I don't know that this feels good. And it's like the thing that I used to do with people that I don't know how to do anymore. And that's also what I wanted to talk about. Is like, for so long, since I had such an empathic deficit, I couldn't see myself enough to really see another person. I used other people to see myself, which everyone does, I think, to some extent. I don't really want to theorize on that. And so these doctors, by throwing pills at me, were able to bring me back to life a couple times as a teenager. Was like renewed my hope in them that they knew what they were doing. Um, because it was incredible. And also because each of those periods of excitement where I was forcibly brought back to life were more and more electric, you know? I don't know what it would have been like if I didn't have all that intervention. It definitely made me worse. Like my identity has become this also because of the medicalization. But my point is that if a virus causes depression, it's probably doing so through your experience of reality. I'm like gonna feel like shit a lot of the time. And I have to work around that. Or I have to figure out a way to relate to that that doesn't make me more miserable. Because that was the whole fucking thing with psilocybin, with the landmark study or whatever. I don't know if that's the right term, that it was in terminally ill cancer patients. And if you are a terminal cancer patient, that is about the epitome of conditions outside of your control. You're literally facing death, your imminent death. There's nothing you can do about it. And these people found a way to, and it's also, well, okay, I need to finish my sentences and not just assume that people can finish them for me. They were able to have this deeply meaningful experience that totally recontextualized their relationship with their experience. And it treated their depression associated with their terminal disease and even their fear of death itself and becoming accepting of it, which is fucking insane. And so that is what they did for me. Okay, that's not, wait, let me clarify. I don't have a terminal disease. I don't have cancer. But I mean, they allowed me to change my relationship with my experience enough and to understand it's been a very long process. But to understand what that even means, Brittany Simon, she's a social media personality, which I hate to say. But she talks about it, she conceptualizes it as levels. And so that's what I feel like this process has been. And there's also other concepts around this, like spiral dynamics and stuff, basically the levels of consciousness that people go through. So I feel like I was trapped at a very early level because of the way that I was built. I was built very different. Truly did not realize how different I was built. I truly met deities, multiple deities, and one of them bitch slapped me and showed me how I was built. All right, so I'm back home now. I was at my mom's house sitting, so this is gonna be recorded over a period of time. So it's going to include lots of different states of experience, tones of voice, affects, and thought structures. There are things that I need to take, whether they're supplements or medications, that do drastically improve my quality of life. Some of my medications I'm sort of stuck on, but lamotrigine in particular, I feel like has really changed my life. But that's also to my point, because lamotrigine is one of those medications that we don't know why it works so well. Works for a lot of different people, a lot of different conditions, and it is one of the only, actually, I don't know if that's correct. I think it's one of the only monotherapies approved for bipolar depression for prevention of episodes, not for acute episodes. But for me, what these treatments are accessing is my experience. Because, so the concept of having a lack of insight in the context of a disability like schizophrenia or autism or dementia as well is so there's the idea that it has to do with viewing yourself as a whole system and essentially being able to detect aberrant behavior and contextualize that within a larger system. And so I basically couldn't do this because I had literally no insight for my entire life. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I also had no theory of mind. And I was not aware that I had no theory of mind because it's something that you can't really become aware of until you take 7 grams of mushrooms and realize that you've never been able to step outside of your own perspective in your life. And that maybe there is something seriously wrong with you or seriously different about you that no one has as of yet addressed. Because I believe that insight and empathy have actually been the, cure for I was very miserable all throughout my life. I've always been deeply depressed. That's why I ended up getting shock therapy and have been on so many medications. And I can say now that I am extremely happy. I'm content. I enjoy my life. I don't feel depressed. I do have PMDD, but I feel like even now my experience of that is slightly different. I mean, I still get the dramatic alterations in self other experience, but the distance I have from this experience and the insight I have into it has fundamentally changed. Although I will say that I think it's possible if I tried to stop any of the treatments that I partake in that I could quickly lose insight again. I'm not really sure how far back I can slide. And so that's also related to something else I wanted to talk about with the metabolic progression of the illness that I watched over my life and these periods of very distinct metabolic shifts. And I said this in 2021 when I came off my birth control, and these cycles became much easier to observe and predict. I said, this feels bioenergetic. This feels like my body just doesn't know how to produce energy correctly. And essentially, that's what the ECT, I feel, made so much worse. And it trapped me in kind of this inactive state. And when I discovered for the first time about, I don't know, like 6 months, maybe almost a year after the ECT, I took opioids and it brought me back. It brought the metabolic activity back online. And I thought I was gone, but apparently I wasn't gone. It was just like my brain could no longer energetically sustain my personality anymore. And so obviously that became a whole obsession with using drugs specifically to get my personality back and to be able to hold a conversation. And also my lifelong struggles with an eating disorder. And what spawned a lot of that was struggling with my own appetite and not understanding why I wanted to binge eat and trying to control that and basically just not allowing my body to do what it needs to do, and all this stuff that I just now have a what feels like a very broad understanding of. I'm sure my understanding of myself will obviously continue to evolve as I get older, but as of now I've basically figured out all the stuff that has happened to me my whole life that I didn't understand, like these blood sugar episodes where, and it's not just blood sugar that does this, it can be caffeine, any kind of stimulant, certain drugs, crashes from certain drugs, but a lot of the time it is blood sugar. And it's just basically like a psychotic meltdown. Rage, especially rage. And I remember the first time I felt that, and that was in fourth grade before the virus even happened to me. So that dimension of my experience was already, preparing itself in the wings. And so I don't remember, obviously, before the ECT very well, but I do remember in the time since the ECT, every time I've caused a major problem with my family and probably with my friends, although that hasn't happened as frequently, every time I had some kind of catastrophic meltdown, it was this same feeling that I can identify now as I need to eat. And even if I had eaten recently within a couple hours, if I had eaten pasta or something that was very carbohydrate heavy, my blood sugar was plummeting within hours. And so now I've figured out a way to eat and fuel my body that is actually backed by a lot of research coming out about using the ketogenic diet and such to treat severe mental illnesses like bipolar and schizophrenia as metabolic disturbances. Because now I see very clearly all these symptoms coalescing, the physical and the mental, of the binge eating and the sleeping and the hyperactivity and the frenetic excitement and the psychosis and the rage and it's like all metabolism. It's all this metabolic process that is just really messing up cellular functioning. And with the caffeine thing or the stimulant rage reaction thing, it didn't take me very long to figure out what that was when I went off my birth control, because that's when the fluctuations in my experience of all this stuff, the metabolic functioning, changed. But if I take N-acetylcysteine, there is no reaction. The reaction just doesn't happen. If it starts to happen, I take NAC, it goes away. And that was a huge impediment to my functioning, and my medications did not address that whatsoever because I need caffeine. I literally need, I have like narcolepsy or something. I refuse to quit caffeine. Now, for instance, when I feel the urge to binge eat or eat a lot of food, I fucking eat a lot of food. because I need it. And I know that these energy cycles happen on their own, and my body is self regulating. Also, now obviously, different than I used to. I eat low carb. I am trying to do it correctly. I'm looking into a dietitian I can work with to do the actual medical keto diet to see how much more improvement I can get in my symptoms. But like, and then obviously this goes back to fucking psychiatry and the sort of like almost like class consciousness that crazy people, lovingly using that term, are gaining around the industry of psychiatry and how they really might not have any fucking clue what's going on. And also, I think this is relevant. Well, so first of all, idea that metabolic disturbance is kind of the core, maybe along with like immune disturbance, kind of mutually playing off each other, chicken and egg type of thing. For me, the immune system is definitely heavily involved, such that these labels that we have created to describe the phenomena that occur from these metabolic processes going haywire in our cells that create, relatively stable patterns that we can identify. But we're also learning that these patterns are not so distinct. And especially in the PMDD subreddit, I see these women have, 10 diagnoses. And we all have like the same, OCD, BPD, ADHD, autism, fibromyalgia, you know what I mean? Bipolar, whatever. So if this can kind of all be addressed by a holistic treatment that addresses this, regardless of the label attached, are those really useful labels? And I think that this extends to PMDD and the kind of debate around premenstrual exacerbation of an existing condition versus like true PMDD, which I see a lot of argument about on the PMDD subreddit that just doesn't really make sense to me. And then this is also related to the whole histamine thing. There's just a lot I want to talk about. I want to say that getting the right label has changed my life, and that now I might not need to identify with it the same way I have the last 2 years in order to figure out, but also that the label itself, like the interventions that I've learned to use because of the label, I could have learned to use those anyway. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, depression was not the right term for what I was experiencing, and trying to treat it with things that have an antidepressant effect was, not giving me the complete results. And negative and cognitive symptoms are actually a much better representation of what I experience. But at the same time, I don't know that it matters that much what I call them, because the treatments that I've used that have improved them, like the few supplements that really, really help, sarcosine, N-acetylcysteine, benfotiamine. What else do I take? Well, I take a bunch of stuff, but the things that really, really help this core disturbance, I feel like, would help a lot of people with a lot of different conditions. And sarcosine and NAC are great. NAC specifically has a lot of research for just being wildly effective for, not for everyone, but when it does work for people. And we need to figure out why it doesn't work for some people. But, and other treatments as well, psilocybin, ketamine, the stuff that we're finding that is really effective for the general population, almost as if the mechanisms are all kind of overlapping. I did read about the concept of a neurodevelopmental to affective continuum, like more pure neurodevelopmental conditions, and then that slides along a continuum to purely mood disorders. And I thought that was interesting. So I do think that that's relevant to PMDD too. But just that because women, we're just so superior physiologically, metabolically, immune function. We have much, much, much higher rates of autoimmune disease. 90% of lupus patients are women. And that is because we were built for this shit. And it's crazy that we're not the ones being studied when really we are the like exemplary, like we are the example of mechanistic processes. Like PMDD symbolizes the effective switch that can happen in any condition where one organizational experience of reality, one state transitions into a different state. that happens with PMDD, but on a timer. It happens predictably, which is fascinating. And I think that having traits of borderline personality disorder or being BPD coded really just means you're susceptible to the kind of dysregulation that allows this kind of dramatic switch in self world interactions. And you kind of build up this repertoire of states. And I think that this is just being human. And I'm not saying, hopefully, this is making sense. Like, we are recently coming to the understanding that BPD is incredibly treatable and that women frequently age out of it. And, it's mostly women who are diagnosed with it, and it occurs in people who've been traumatized. And so I think reducing PMDD to histamine in the way that lots of people are doing because antihistamines happen to be effective is just the same kind of reductionist pharmaceutical lobbying induced idea that we have of like depression being serotonin deficiency and psychosis being too much dopamine. Like, obviously there is some truth to that, but there's a much larger system going on. Like, even in depression, SSRIs don't work because they increase serotonin. They work because they trigger this cascade of homeostatic regulatory processes that then teaches your body how, what homeostasis is. It brings you back to reality. So reducing this to one neurotransmitter system just doesn't make any sense because, like I said, it is an organizational state. It is the whole functional architecture and connectivity of your brain and body that is creating these experiences. And is it possible that histamine is involved? 1000%, because histamine is a really important neurotransmitter. It's also involved heavily in wakefulness. But I do think, because I've seen people post about the vagus nerve mechanism of famotidine and then still relate it to histamine. That vagal mechanism was found to be independent of the histamine 2 receptor, as in it was not dependent on the histamine system. It was dependent on the alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor in the vagus nerve. So this receptor does not respond to histamine. It responds to acetylcholine and also to famotidine, because drugs are just chemical structures, right, that mimic chemical structures that are close enough to the ones that we create to bind to receptors in our body. And so I think it is possible that there's even more off-target activity because most drugs are dirty drugs, meaning that they have this kind of non-selective, they bind to lots of different receptors. That is actually how the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia came about to begin with, because antihistamines were found to treat psychosis. And then when that mechanism was investigated, it was found to be mediated by dopamine receptors. Is it possible that the H2 receptor is involved? Yes. But what is so fascinating to me about famotidine and has kept me fixated on it for so long, and why I think it's so important, is because I think it's an example of one of these treatments that accesses just a core homeostatic switch and allows your body to regulate itself back to reality. And so I think that this extremely powerful vagus nerve mechanism, which is a mechanism that has been investigated for a lot of various conditions because it's so powerful, I think Occam's razor sort of dictates that this explanation makes the most sense. I do like the most complicated answer possible, and famotidine also interacts with glycogen synthase, which is an enzyme involved in metabolism that is a ubiquitous target for psychiatric medications that changes your metabolism. Also involved in body pattern memory, and specifically one of the subtypes of enzymes has been linked to bipolar disorder. And the body pattern memory thing, like basically the developmental arc of an organism, is basically this homeostatic problem solving dynamic intelligent process using the intelligence of your body. And I'm referencing Michael Levin's work right now, who I'm obsessed with. There are mechanisms to treat disease that access this core intelligence of your body, basically your body's understanding of itself as a whole system. And this applies to cancer research, limb regeneration and reconstructive medicine, neurodegenerative disease, and there are various ways to access this innate evolutionary ancient intelligence, and we are really just at the beginning. So I was with my friend once. Well, it's actually someone I'm not friends with anymore. But I was with her when she was on mushrooms, and she was getting really emotional thinking about her coworkers and various people in her life, and was just basically overcome with emotion by the pure empathy, and was talking about how much she just loves people and how cool people are. And I thought this was so beautiful, and I loved her and I admired her so much. I didn't relate to it. I felt at that moment sort of that I was in a separate world, which is true actually, because what I realized after I had enough experience with the mushrooms was that I basically don't exist in reality and have no understanding of other people or myself as real. And that this insight, empathy, theory of mind thing is sort of what shapes the dynamic of my whole experience. So essentially, I feel like I saw the world sort of like how I feel social media overlays this like gamified matrix onto the world. I feel like that's how I had to experience the world, because this is also connected to something I heard about like different subtypes of autism, and one of the subtypes essentially being people who are super hypersensitive, just take in so much information, and that they're especially likely to avoid eye contact. And so now that I have more perspective of myself and other people, and I can actually see us interacting, it's clear to me that this was adaptive. This was just the way that my brain created reality because it was what it could handle and how I could navigate, especially socially, basically patterns and symbols, patterns and symbols. And obviously, in order to have delusions, which usually involve other people, it's like this autistic thing where everything is connected back to you and you're the center piece, instead of seeing people as all of these individual centerpieces of their own experience. So now that I come to interactions with more of this depth of experience, I can see why my brain couldn't do that, because it's too much for me. There's too much information. Interacting with people is too so deeply affecting. Maybe I'll get used to it. And I was really embarrassed to talk about this on the internet. And when I tried to, people didn't really believe me. They were like, oh, it's normal to not have that kind of psychedelic empathy when you're not on shrooms. And I was like, no, you guys don't understand. I don't have empathy. I care about people very deeply, but I literally couldn't see anything from, you can't really see from someone else's perspective, but I was so cognitively rigid. And it's still very difficult. Anyways, yeah, so I had been embarrassed in the past because it's just kind of an unusual experience of life, but I truly feel like there's no morality to it. And that, obviously I didn't create myself this way. My body created itself this way. And I'm just dealing with the material of it. So I don't know, this might be where I leave off. This is going to be pretty long already. And if you want me to go into anything I talked about more deeply, maybe I could make this more of a series. All right.